I now want to turn to a very sensitive area, equality legislation. I have already demonstrated that, under a democratic system, equality of legal rights and legal obligations is crucial. But this is only one manner in which people might be equal. Is it desirable, or even possible, to have laws that enforce equality in other ways? Now, one way in which people can be equal is if outcomes are the same for all. So, everyone lives in identical houses, earns an identical amount, and so on. Desiring equality as so defined leads to philosophies such as communism, which, however fine they may sound in theory, have universally been disastrous in practice. And such philosophies will always fail in practice because achieving equality of outcomes is impossible. The reason for this is simple: people are all different. Thus, two people in identical circumstances will have different abilities, preferences, and objectives. They will therefore act in different ways. This inevitably means that different things will happen to them over time, and they will end up with different outcomes. One may be happily married, another may be rich, another will have a job they find emotionally rewarding, and another will laze their life away. It is simply not possible to force all these outcomes, for all these different people, to be the same. Another definition of equality is that everyone should have the same opportunities. If we accept that equality of outcomes is impossible, then, on the assumption that children are raised by their parents, children will all be brought up in different circumstances, learn different things, know different people, and so have different opportunities. Given the differences between people, inequality of opportunity is therefore also inevitable. However, while aiming at equality of opportunities and outcomes is chasing a rainbow, it may be desirable that government should seek to ensure that certain opportunities are available to all, for example through a system of state education, and that people should be protected from certain adverse outcomes, for example by providing them with state benefits. These matters will be covered in more detail later, when I consider some of the wider roles that might be taken on by government. Another area where legislators try to create equality is anti-discrimination legislation. The objective of such legislation is to ensure that certain groups of people, for example women or ethnic minorities, are treated fairly. One problem with anti-discrimination legislation is that because discrimination is often difficult to prove, anti-discrimination legislation is divisive and difficult to enforce. Now, discrimination in itself is necessary. We discriminate between people every time we choose between them. If I need someone to fix a leaking pipe and hire one plumber rather than another, then I am discriminating between them. If you advertise a job and award it to one of many candidates, you have discriminated in favor of that candidate. If Ethel chooses to marry Bob rather than Bill, then she has discriminated between them. Anti-discrimination legislation therefore does not outlaw all discrimination. It outlaws discrimination on the particular grounds specified in the legislation. When making choices between people, I will typically consider a range of factors. If I am choosing a plumber, I might consider the price they are charging, when they are available, whether they have good online reviews, how rapidly they responded to my request for a quote, and whether they were polite when I spoke to them over the telephone. The weight I put on each of these factors will inevitably differ from the weight you might put on them. The plumber I choose may well not be the plumber that you would have selected if you were in my place. In the context of anti-discrimination legislation, this has several implications. Firstly, it makes it easy for you to point to a decision that I have made, say that you would have made a different one, and then claim that the reason I did not was because I discriminated on illegal grounds. And there is no way I can disprove this. You are not making a claim about the physical fact of who I hired, but about what was going on in my head when I made that decision. On the other hand, with so many factors in play, even if I did make a decision on illegal grounds, it is very hard for you to prove that I did so. So, the nature of the legislation makes it easy for spurious claims to appear credible, and difficult for legitimate claims to be proved. Unscrupulous people can make unfounded accusations and bring expensive to defend cases against companies, either from petty malevolence, or in the hope of personal gain. Concern that such accusations may be raised leads to companies tacitly considering the gender or ethnicity of candidates when making hiring decisions, even though the legislation explicitly forbids this. Meanwhile, companies that want to discriminate will set up processes and documentation that make it appear that they are not doing so, and, if necessary, bluff it out in court. Another problem with anti-discrimination legislation is that it directly clashes with people's property rights. Recall that the fundamental purpose of law and order, and the reason it is so desirable, is that it protects people's property and persons. This reasoning implies that when framing legislation, protecting people's persons and their property rights should take priority over other objectives. Now, the whole concept of property is that if you own something, you should have control over it. You should therefore be able to choose who has access to it, or can use it. If the law undermines this, it is undermining its very reason for existing. In passing, I note that this is also problematic for laws such as the right to roam. Giving people the right to wander about on someone else's private property, as they please, wherever and whenever they choose, is a gross violation of the property owner's property rights. To return to discrimination, consider a situation where I own a shop. That business is my property. Protecting my property rights therefore requires that I should retain the choice of who I do business with, and on what terms. If I do not want to do business with either an individual, or a certain section of the population, then, no matter how despicable that might be, the logic of property rights says that I should be free so to choose. If I do not want to employ certain people, or I am only willing to do so on unfavorable terms, then, no matter how despicable that might be, the logic of property rights says that I should be free so to choose. Anti-discrimination laws directly conflict with these rights. Forcing me to pass my property to someone, when I don't want to, by compelling me to sell something to them, or by making me pay them a certain wage, is robbing me, and it is a basic purpose of the law to prevent this. On this basis, anti-discrimination legislation seems undesirable. However, it is not unique in violating property rights, every single piece of tax legislation does so. And supporters of anti-discrimination legislation will point out that it protects people from being underpaid, or overcharged, or being unable to access certain products or services at all. And protecting people is also a basic purpose of the law. Suppose there is a shop that has arbitrarily decided that it will not serve me. That is only a big problem for me, if there are no other shops that will sell me whatever it is that I want to buy, at a fair price. Again, if an employer refuses to pay me the same as it pays everyone else, or to employ me at all, well, I can take my labor to another employer that will pay me a fair wage. In fact, I don't want to transact with people who don't like me, and so I would much prefer to take my custom or labor elsewhere. I may be upset that I am disliked for no apparent reason, but, well, some people have strange ideas, it takes all sorts, and there are plenty of people who do like me. Now, these arguments about going elsewhere only hold if there is somewhere else to go. If discrimination is so widespread that a group of people is effectively denied access to certain goods or services at a fair price, or is universally underpaid, then anti-discrimination legislation will be justified. When such legislation was introduced in the UK, this was indeed the case. For example, prior to the introduction of anti-discrimination legislation, women were almost universally paid less than men for doing the same job. Again, black immigrants were imported into the UK from the West Indies in the 1950s and 60s to do jobs that were considered too menial for the white British working class, and were not considered for higher paid roles. But, is this still the case? There is an argument that it is not. That is not to say that there are no racists and sexists in the UK. There are. But they are a minority, and subject to censure by the majority, who consider, and rightly in my view, that discriminating against someone for no other reason than their sex, or the color of their skin, is irrational and offensive. And, although revolutionary activists may complain about white privilege and institutional racism, the facts do not support their claims. Indeed, the majority of institutions and professions are currently hypersensitive to accusations of racism or sexism, and are bending over backwards to encourage non-white, non-male, non-heterosexual, and differently gendered applicants, and support them in successful careers, promoting them to senior positions. And, if this description of the state of society is accepted, then it can coherently be argued that anti-discrimination legislation has done its job, is no longer necessary, and should be repealed. You may find this to be an uncomfortable conclusion, and ask if abolishing anti-discrimination legislation will inevitably mean that we revert to a society where women are systematically paid less than men, and landlords can advertise property to rent on the basis of no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Surely, you may say, removing the protections afforded by this legislation would ultimately lead to apartheid, and, beyond that, the Holocaust. Well, not necessarily. The following factors would continue to protect against these outcomes. The first point to make is that both apartheid and the Holocaust were a result of legal systems that explicitly did not apply the same laws to everybody. I have already established that equality of legal rights is a key principle. The second point is about transparency and the risk of adverse publicity. Consider a gay couple who book a hotel room, and on turning up are told that they cannot have the room, because the owner of the hotel has religious objections to homosexuality. Unless the gay couple had previously been made aware of this, then the hotelier has actively deceived them, by allowing them to make, and pay for, a booking which the hotel will not honor. Even if the hotel has not taken any money from them, this deception will have cost the couple time, and probably travel expenses and what have you. I strongly believe that deceiving people out of their property should be illegal, and so, in this scenario, the hotelier would have committed a crime. So, if the hotelier wished to discriminate in this way, without falling foul of the law, she would have to prominently advertise the fact that she will not let rooms to gay couples. That would be likely to lead to significant adverse publicity and consequent reputational damage, which would deter businesses from discriminating. Again, if a business has negotiated a pay settlement with employee representatives that includes skin color as a factor in setting pay levels, then this will be obvious, and the risk of adverse publicity will be significant. Note, however, that this point is not universal. In some cases, discrimination will not be so obvious, and the risk of adverse publicity will not be such a significant deterrent. The third point is about economics. Any business that refuses to sell its goods or services to a section of the population is narrowing its potential market. Any business that refuses to hire from a section of the population, or offers that group of people undesirable employment terms, is narrowing the potential talent pool from which it can draw. Both these are likely to be damaging to the business. Further, if people consider that a business is discriminating against them, they can take their labor or their custom elsewhere. This creates a market opportunity, which one would expect competing businesses to exploit. So in general, for a business to discriminate against a section of the population does not make economic sense. The fourth point relates to the public sector. I am suggesting that, if, despite all the disincentives I have just listed, an organization in the private sector wished to discriminate, on any grounds it chooses, and does so openly, then that should not be a crime. But, in a democracy, it would not be reasonable for the public sector to discriminate against any group of voters in this way. The logic of a democracy requires that a democratic government is an equal opportunities employer. Further, the public sector has a choice about which suppliers to use, and can exclude suppliers who are operating discriminatory practices. The public sector can therefore bring significant pressure to bear, without imposing legislation that infringes individual property rights. The fifth point is about education. I believe that the key purpose of state education is to prepare children to become voters. That includes imparting an understanding of the key principles on which a democracy is based, and those principles include that all voters have equal obligations and responsibilities, and that all votes have equal value. If people understand these principles, and the logic on which they are based, then they are less likely to discriminate against people on utterly illogical grounds. And, in practice, I have personally observed that, as the level of education about these matters has increased over the last 50 years or so, levels of racism and sexism in society have materially declined. My sixth point is, I think, obvious, but worth making. Repealing anti-discrimination laws would emphatically not legalize assaulting or threatening people, or stealing or damaging their property. The primary purpose of the law is to protect people from such things, and I am not suggesting that should ever change. Where racism, sexism, or any other views manifest themselves in such forms, I strongly believe that the law should punish the perpetrators. I have some final observations. My first observation is that abolishing anti-discrimination legislation would open the door to so-called positive discrimination. This seeks to remedy a situation where one group of people is being unreasonably discriminated against, by unreasonably discriminating against another group of people. Thus, not only is positive discrimination unjust and pernicious, it is also self-contradictory. However, as a supporter of individual choice and property rights, legalizing such idiocy is a price I am prepared to pay. It is possible that abolishing anti-discrimination legislation could cause further fragmentation of society, creating a culture where people choose to only interact with people that are in their particular group, whether this be based on race, sexual orientation, or whatever. Democracy is a group endeavor, and is undermined if society fragments to the extent that voters no longer feel that they are all in this together. This would be an unfortunate outcome, albeit one that people would freely have chosen. On the other hand, it may be that the fear people have of falling foul of current anti-discrimination legislation causes people to focus on such differences, and abolishing that legislation would actually encourage more people to simply ignore them. However, it may be that here I am indulging in utopianism. My final point is that, although I believe there to be a case for repealing anti-discrimination legislation when it is no longer needed, and I suggest that this point may have been reached, if I am wrong in my analysis, and abolishing anti-discrimination legislation did lead to the re-emergence of widespread discrimination against certain groups, or there were other unexpected negative outcomes that outweighed the benefits, then the legislation should be reinstated. To stay with controversial subjects, I am now going to talk about hate crime. In the UK, a hate crime is defined as any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability or perceived disability, race or perceived race, or religion or perceived religion, or sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or transgender identity or perceived transgender identity. If a crime is identified as a hate crime, the perpetrator can be subject to a more severe punishment. This legislation is pernicious. Firstly, whether or not a crime is a hate crime depends entirely upon what the victim, or indeed any other person, feels about it. This is entirely subjective. If I say that something you did was a hate crime, then it was. You can be subject to a more severe punishment purely on my word, with no material evidence, and no possible appeal. This is a terrible basis for a law. Secondly, I want the law to protect my person and property. I want people who attack me or steal from me, or whatever, to be punished, regardless of why they did it. I don't care if the people who beat me up, when I was walking home from the pub, did so because of my religion, or just for the fun of it. In both cases the same crime was committed, I was beaten up, and so in both cases the punishment should be the same. Similarly, if a thief dislikes homosexuals, then that is surely separate from the fact that he has committed a robbery. Should a homophobe really be subject to a lesser degree of punishment, if he robs a straight rather than a gay person? And finally, committing a crime is a hostile act, so anyone who has a crime committed against them is likely to believe that the crime has been motivated by hostility and prejudice. But, unless the victim is disabled, or religious, or has particular sexual orientations, then, even if the crime was indeed motivated by hostility or prejudice, that crime will not be classed as a hate crime, and the perpetrator will receive a lighter sentence. Thus, rather than ensuring the equal treatment of certain groups, this legislation directly undermines the fundamental principle that everyone should receive the same degree of protection from the law. Related to laws against hate crime are laws against hate speech. And these laws are equally problematic. Why do I think so? Well, let's start from first principles. Freedom of choice includes freedom to express opinions, and freedom to criticize. I do not seek to constrain your freedom to make choices. But that does not mean that I have to approve of the choices you make. And if you do or say something that I think is stupid, well, I reserve the right to choose to say so. Not the right to assault you, or threaten you, but the right to state my opinion, and to laugh at you. Society is a group exercise, we all learn from each other. And we will not be able to do that if we are all too scared of hurting each other's feelings to say what we think, or, even worse, if it becomes a criminal offense to do so. But, you may say, if the law exists to protect people, then shouldn't the law protect people from hearing things that upset them? Well, I don't think so. Firstly, I am very upset by the idea of forbidding people from expressing their honestly held opinions. So, people are going to be upset, whether you pass such a law or not. But, secondly, what would be the practical consequences of such a law? In its most general form, such a law would allow you to prosecute me if I say something that upsets you. But how can I know what you may find upsetting? People are all different, and get upset by different things. You could take any statement of mine, and claim it has upset you. And how could I defend myself? Your feelings are private to you, and only you have direct access to them, so you are the only person who can know for certain whether or not you were upset. So, any such law would allow you to prosecute me, and have me convicted, based only on your word. That is not a good law. But, you might say, this is not about banning people from saying anything anyone might find upsetting. No one is arguing for that. This is about banning hate speech. This is about preventing people from stirring up hatred against other people, not because of what those other people choose to do, but because of what they unavoidably are. And laws can be drafted that define hate speech, so whether or not the law has been broken is a matter of objective fact rather than subjective feelings. But how do legislators do that in practice? They draw up a list of particular groups of people, defined by race, religion, sexuality, and whatever, and outlaw people from stirring up hatred against those groups. And I observe several fundamental problems with this. My first observation is that the legislation goes far beyond protecting people from hatred on the basis of what they unavoidably are. It also protects people on the basis of the choices that they have made. This is because membership of at least some of the protected groups is a matter of choice. People may not be able to choose their race, but they can certainly choose their religion. You may not be able to choose your sexuality, in terms of who you are sexually attracted to, but you can choose what, if anything, you do about the attractions you feel. For example, you can choose to do nothing about them, to be celibate. And for example, if you choose to rape little boys, because you are sexually attracted to them, then my view is that you deserve to have some righteous hatred whipped up against you. My second observation is that the legislation only protects specified arbitrary groups, which are thereby privileged. The result is that it is legal to stir up hatred against fat people, but not against Christians. It is legal to incite hatred against short people, but not against black people. What is the logic in that? Why should the law give more protection to black Christians than to short, fat people? Surely the law should defend everyone, as unique individual people, and not just people who happen to fall into an arbitrary group. My third observation is that the concept of stirring up hatred is vague, and so the law can be used to shut down discussion over a wide range of subjects. After all, by definition, if I express a negative opinion about something that you do, then I am inviting people to disapprove of your behavior. At what point does inviting disapproval become stirring up hatred? Is it a hate crime if I point out that many religions condemn homosexuality, and that this leads followers of those religions to behave towards homosexuals in ways that I deplore, and I suggest that others should feel the same way about this behavior? What if I get really worked up about it, and express the same sentiment using more emotional and less temperate language? And what if I criticize certain antisocial behaviors, which are not essentially linked to a particular group, but are nonetheless more prevalent amongst members of one of the legally privileged groups? Can that be interpreted as stirring up hatred against that group? Should I be prosecuted? The result of such legislation is that people are afraid to speak out about the actions of people in the privileged groups. For example, this creates a climate where social workers are afraid to speak out against grooming gangs, because they are afraid of being accused of racist hate speech, so no action is taken, and so hundreds of girls are sexually abused. The law is supposed to protect people from rape, not protect rapists. Such laws fail on every level. So, I am for freedom of speech. But I do think that there should be a limit to that freedom. The fundamental principle of a democracy is that in order to preserve law and order, which is to our mutual benefit, we all agree to abide by our collective decisions. Breaking the law therefore directly undermines democracy, and so it is entirely logical that, in a democracy, it should be illegal to encourage people to break the law. Otherwise, people should be free to express any opinion that they like. At this point, you may say that I am proposing, for example, that racism should be legal. And, yes, in a sense, I am. I am saying that racists should be free to express their ridiculous views, and that the rest of us should be free to laugh at their idiocy, and point out exactly why their arguments are unfounded and incoherent. But that does not mean that I think the law should not protect people from racists. It should. In fact, I think the law should go further, and protect people not only from racists, but from everyone. And how do I think the law should do this? Well, by protecting the person and private property of every individual voter. If you violate someone's person or property rights, then the law should punish you. The question of whether or not a crime has been committed should be based on the events that have occurred in the physical world, not upon the subjective opinions of the criminal, or the victim of crime, or anybody else. A crime should be a crime, regardless of who commits it and who it is committed against, regardless of the race, religion, sexuality, gender, height, weight, political beliefs, wealth, football team, or any other feature of the criminal or victim. The law should apply to all individuals and protect them all equally. That is what it means to have objective laws that confer equal rights and obligations on all voters. That is what it means in a democracy for laws to be fair.